right, folks. Well, let's get started here. Today we are moving on to the next portion of, and the last portion of this unit. The first portion, as you know, was the Age of Isms, talking about reactionary conservatism in Europe after the Napoleonic era, as well as the Age of Romanticism, and the second part was the revolutions of 1848, as well as a number of other liberal revolutions that happened before that. We talked about utopian socialism and all those kinds of things, and now we're moving on to the third and last portion, which is the Age of Realpolitik. The Age of Realpolitik is nicely characterized in a short clip that I'm going to send to you, if I can find it. And let's do this one. I can't show this on my own screen, otherwise my thing will get blocked. But I'm gonna send you this link here. Watch that clip, and we're gonna talk about it. Okay, so hopefully you got a chance to watch that clip. Let's just talk a little bit about that clip. That clip comes from a movie with Anthony Hopkins, who also famously played Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. Um, that clip comes from a movie where he plays a butler at a British noble estate. And the clip actually comes outside of the time context that we're in right now. That clip is set in the years before World War II starting. Okay, so that's a little bit ahead of where we're at right now. But the little speech that he gives there gives you a real good idea about that Christopher Reeves gives. Now, if you don't know who Christopher Reeves is, he's a little bit before your guys' time. He's even, frankly, a little before my time. He made his biggest role in Superman in the early 80s, but he was in a horse riding accident that paralyzed him from the neck down and ultimately ended up dying several years later as a result. But he plays the man that stands up, the American senator who stands up and gives the speech in that little clip. And in it, he talks about how the last thing Europe needs right now are noble gentlemen coming together with their words of appeasement and praise and all of these other things and good intentions, because they are out of their element. He says that what you guys need are real politicians, the age of real politic, the age of professional politicians, or they're headed for disaster. And that clip is very much what realpolitik is about. Okay, we are entering into an era of the professional politician, people who have a very keen, esoteric knowledge of what it takes to be a successful politician. Now, many of the successful politicians in this era are going to be conservative politicians. However, they're going to practice a new brand of conservatism that highlights reform in the interest of maintaining control and order of government. So when we talk about guys from the age of realpolitik, such as Otto von Bismarck, huge name that you need to remember in Euro, okay? He is essentially solely responsible for the German unification movement's success. And that's really what we're looking at today is Prussia and Italian unification, well, German and Italian unification, these two movements led by the German state of Prussia in the case of Germany and the Italian state of Sardinia, Piedmont, Sardinia. And the Italian political figure is a guy by the name of Count Cavour, another conservative politician, but it's the efforts of these pragmatic, practical, real, professional politicians who are able to use their political acumen as a tool to get very concise, directed, well-organized political goals achieved. And so the age of realpolitik, we are done with the age of romanticism. We are now in the age of realism. And these guys are going to have real, pragmatic, practical plans for achieving their goals, unlike those politicians of the romantic liberal nationalist era of the last section that we talked about of the age of the revolutions of 1848. Their goals in many cases failed, in part because they had overly idealized, spontaneous, and perhaps overly radical goals that were not very practical and were not carried out in an organized fashion. And so we see these romantic revolutions fail, and in their wake, we see the rise of professional politicians, Machiavellian politicians in many cases, going all the way back to the Renaissance when we learned about Machiavelli and the Prince. And several of the things that Machiavelli talked about in the Prince back in the 1500s are going to be some of the same techniques used by professional politicians in the age of realpolitik to obtain their goals. So the major theme of this section here is that the failure of the revolutions of 1848 led to a new age of politics governed by ruthlessly practical leaders who achieved their goals incrementally and efficiently. This new type of politics was exemplified by mostly three people. Napoleon III in France, who's probably, to be honest, Napoleon III is in some sense probably the most liberal of them, but nonetheless, towards the end of his career, starts to become much more despotic and conservative in his style of rule. Count Cavour, as I mentioned, in Italy, and Otto von Bismarck in Germany. So here you can see kind of where we're at in the process of things. The French Revolution and Napoleon, we talked about that. We talked about the age of Metternich, and then we talked about the age of realpolitik, which is what we're in right now. So, the failures of the revolutions of 1848. As you remember, Germany, nationalists and liberals met at the Frankfurt Parliament. And the Frankfurt Parliament failed to get the support of the Prussian king, Frederick William IV, in establishing a constitutional monarchy for a unified Germany. And I mentioned to you that his actual words were that he refused to accept a crown from the gutter and instead actually went to the old school noble route and claimed divine right, that he was given the power to rule from God. And so this was known as the Humiliation of Olmutz, where Frederick William IV proposed a plan for German unity, but refused to accept the crown from the gutter. And Austria, this was the other side of it, was that there were several plans for a unified Germany. One of them was known as the Grossdeutsch Plan. The Grossdeutsch Plan was going to accept Austria as part of German rule, but Austria, being its own independent empire, would not accept a plan for German unity, okay, unless Austria was at the forefront of that movement. Basically, this is what, let me read this for you. Austria would accept a plan for German unity only if Prussia accepted the leadership of the German Bund, which was dominated by Austria. All right, and Prussia, of course, does not want to see Austria become the leader of a unified Germany. They are the ones, the Prussians are the ones who want to lead that movement, and Prussia would not accept its loss of sovereignty and stepped back. So the Grossdeutsch Plan versus the Kleindeutsch Plan was the other one. The Kleindeutsch Plan was a plan for German unity that left Austria out. Now, why would they want to include Austria at all? Remember that there are a lot of Germans in Austria. You know, Austrians speak German, and many famous people who we consider to be, you know, of German descent are actually from Austria, like, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? And so there was this idea of all German people should be in the same German state, but what about Austria, which has its own empire, a multi-ethnic empire, and how do we fit Austria in? So some people said, well, let's leave Austria out. They can handle their own affairs. They've been separate from Prussia and the rest of the German states for a long time, the Holy Roman Empire and so on. So let's just have them run their own affairs and leave them out. And that was the Kleindeutsch plan. And that is ultimately the plan that is put into execution by this guy, Otto von Bismarck. And this is him pictured in 1862. He is going to be the foremost master at the game of European political chess. Okay, he very much views the landscape of the European political situation as a game of chess, and he is always several moves ahead of everyone else. He's a political genius, and so a lot of times we say that Bismarck is the master of realpolitik, this idea of politics based on reality rather than idealism. And the two terms that are often associated with him are blood and iron. And so he is in part going to be getting his way through waging war, but the kinds of wars that Bismarck wages are going to be isolated wars. They're going to be extremely well thought out before executing them so as to limit influence from other nations becoming involved so that his goals can be achieved. The last thing that he wants to do is create a continental war where all the different nations gang up on Prussia because they're upsetting the balance of power. So he wages very isolated wars, using war the same way as a surgical scalpel, very precisely, and minimizing damage to both his own state as well as the overall general's balance of political power in Europe at this time. Here's a quote from Bismarck. "It is true that we can hardly escape complications in Germany, although we do not seek them. Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism, but to her power. The South German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, would like to indulge in liberalism, and because of that, no one will assign Prussia's role to them. Prussia must collect her forces and hold them in reserve for an opportune moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the Treaty of Vienna," going back to the Congress of Vienna, "our frontiers have not been favorably designed for a healthy body politic. Not by speeches in majorities will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of 1848 and 49, but by iron and blood." Okay, and so you can see the difference in sentiment of guys like Bismarck, who wanted to use much more pragmatic, practical goals in achieving political influence than the methods used by the liberal revolutionaries of 1848, whose movements largely failed. Italy. So Austrian forces were driven out of northern Italy while French forces were removed from southern Italy and Sicily. Giuseppe Mazzini was the romantic revolutionary of 1848-1849, established the Roman Republic in 1849, but ultimately Mazzini's goals to create a unified Italy via the mechanism of romantic liberal nationalism failed. So the failure of Italian revolutionaries to work together effectively resulted in both Austria and France forcefully taking back control over those respective territories in Italy that they had managed for some time. And then Austria, the Austrian Empire, remember with the revolutions of 1848, Hungarian forces led by Louis Kossuth went to war against Austria and penetrated to the very gates of Vienna, but the Austrian army, with the help of ethnic minorities in the empire as well as with the help of the Russians, defeated the Hungarians and managed to preserve the empire. And so we talk about the February Revolution, where, in France, This resulted in the overthrow of King Louis Philippe and the establishment of the Second French Republic led by Alphonse Lamartine. This should say France, actually, sorry. Okay, France. The June Days Revolution pitted the bourgeoisie against the working classes and conservatives who supported the army, which restored order under the General Cavaignac. And then Louis Napoleon, who also was a conservative, ends up being elected president overwhelmingly in France. So these are kind of the stories of the major places we're talking about in the post-revolution days of 1848. So the emergence of realpolitik after 1848, the failure of the revolutions of 1848 for liberals and romantics demonstrated that strong idealism was not enough to accomplish the revolutionary goals of the era. So we enter into a new age of realism, which replaced romanticism as the dominant philosophy, political philosophy, after 1850. And we also see realism extended into art and literature and philosophy as well. A political outgrowth of realism was the notion of realpolitik, the accomplishing of one's practical goals via political goals via practical means, rather than having idealism drive the political decisions. So, a new political era where nationalist goals were achieved step by step in Machiavellian fashion via, for example, the German unification movement, Italian unification, Hungarian autonomy in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where in the Compromise of 1867, Austria becomes a dual monarchy known as Austria-Hungary, where Hungarians are given their political autonomy in the Austrian Empire. And then in France, Emperor Napoleon III, aka Louis Napoleon, would have to cater to liberals in order to maintain effective control. So, talking about these kinds of things, the first major conflict that happens after the Napoleonic era is known as the Crimean War. The Crimean War also holds another unique historical achievement, which is that it's the first European war in history to be photographed. And so, prior to this, photography was still in its infancy, and no wars had been fought yet until the Crimean War, where taking photographs of the actual war became a possibility. And so I wanted to just take a minute to show you this because they're pretty cool. Some of these photographs, and it just goes to show you how much things have changed in the last, whatever that is, 170 years. Okay, Crimean War photos. There are some really cool ones. Continue to cite. Close this. Here we can see some imagery from the Crimean War. I guess those are still pieces of art. Here's a photo. There's a lot more than are listed there. What about this one? Let's try this out. Yeah. Soldiers battling during the Crimean War, 1855. British and French soldiers relax and share a drink during the Crimean War. This is Florence Nightingale. We're going to talk about her in just a little bit. officers of Britain's 71st Highlanders, British soldiers of the Crimean War who have lost limbs. The Crimean War, even though it happens about 60 or so years before the start of World War I, there are some similarities between the two wars. And so this gives you kind of a cool look at the first war that was photographed in history. Pretty neat, really. So let's talk about the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, the first major failure after the concert of Europe. And its credibility was undermined, the concert of Europe's credibility was undermined by the failure of the great powers of Britain, Prussia, France, Russia, Austria to cooperate during the revolutions of 1848 and 1849. So, between 1848 and 1878, peace in Europe was interrupted by the Crimean War and another war that took place about 30 years later, 25 years later, the Russo-Turkish War. Let's talk about the Crimean War, though. Causes of the Crimean War. The major cause is that there was a dispute between two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land, an area known as Palestine. Now, in 1852, the Turks, who were in control of Palestine, agreed to Napoleon III's demand to provide enclaves in the Holy Land for the protection of Roman Catholic religious orders. Okay? So, the Turks agreed to French leader Napoleon III's demand to provide enclaves in the Holy Land for the protection of Roman Catholics. All right? However, you would think, like, what's the big deal? It seems like Turkey is doing a favor to Roman Catholics in Palestine. Yes. However, this agreement seemed to jeopardize existing agreements, which provided the same access to Greek Orthodox religious orders, which were favored by Russia. So Russia and France find themselves fighting over these holy territories in the Ottoman Empire. All right? And Tsar Nicholas I, who is the Tsar at this time, ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces on the Danube River. And Russia said that they would withdraw their troops once the Turks had guaranteed rights for Orthodox Christians in Palestine. Okay? So Russia is very much stirring the pot here, and remember that they have their own political goals because Russia is trying to encroach on territories of the sick man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire, remember, is referred to as the sick man of Europe. And as the sick man of Europe, its power is dwindling, and we already had seen the Greek movement that saw Greece break away from Ottoman control, and now Russia is going to try to make their way further south and chip away at Ottoman territories to gain land from the Ottoman territories that would allow them to have access to the Mediterranean Sea. This is ultimately Russia's goal. So Nicholas I ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces along the Danube River, and then once they had guaranteed rights for Eastern Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land, they would withdraw their troops. But the Turks said, how dare you occupy territories and act this hostile towards us? We are going to declare war on Russia. And they do so in 1853 when Nicholas I refused to withdraw Russian troops from these Danubian provinces, meaning along the Danube River. And in 1854, Britain and France declared war against Russia because they seemingly were upsetting the balance of power. And to some, this was a major surprise because the Turks weren't Christians. Yet the Christian powers of Britain and France come in on the side of the Ottoman Empire against Russia, who is definitely aggressing this entire conflict. So, the 4 points included the following provisions. Once Russia is defeated in the war, Russia had to renounce claims to the occupied principalities along the Danube. Navigation in the mouth of the Danube River, which is on the Black Sea, had to be internationalized so that no one nation controlled it. Russia had to renounce its special role of Greek Orthodox Christians within the empire as well. Now, that's not all of the 4 points, but those are the main ones. And so in 1855, Piedmont, Sardinia from Italy joined the war against Russia, coming in on the side of the British and the French. Austria agreed to the 4 points and gave Russia an ultimatum to comply, or that Austria would also join the war. So this is a result of Russia and the leadership of Nicholas I, Tsar Nicholas I in 1853, not really looking ahead a few steps as to the kinds of outcomes that this could elicit. Because very quickly, after Russia was viewed as provoking this war, Britain, France, Piedmont, Sardinia, and now Austria are all coming in against Nicholas I. And fortunately for Russia, Nicholas I had every intention of continuing to fight the war, but he dies. And he dies in 1855. And the new Tsar that takes over for Nicholas I is Alexander II. By the way, in case I did not tell you this last class, I'm going to give you an acronym to remember the 5 Russian Tsars, the last 5 Tsars of Russia, throughout the 19th century, and that is Anon. Alex I, Nicholas I, Alex II, Alex III, and then Nicholas II. Those are the last 5 Tsars of Russia throughout the entire 19th century. And Nicholas I dies during the Crimean War in 1855. He is succeeded by Alexander II, who ultimately did not have the same sentiment of his predecessor, Nicholas I, in continuing to wage this war. And Alexander, who was opposed to continuing the war, agrees to the 4 points and ends it. So, fighting the war. Most of the war was fought on the Crimean Peninsula. Now, in case you don't know where that is, that's right here. This is Crimea. In recent years, I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but Russia, in the late part of the Obama administration, Obama's second term in office, maybe around 2014 or 2015, Russia famously went into Crimea and basically just annexed it. And you might think, well, wasn't it their territory? Not technically, it wasn't. It was the territory of Ukraine, which is a sovereign nation. So when Russia went into Crimea and took it over, here's the reason that other powers didn't intervene is because, number one, people don't want to go to war against Russia over Crimea, but number two, a lot of the people living in Crimea on this peninsula are Russian. Nationally, they recognize themselves as Russian rather than Ukrainian. And so because of the sentiment of many people within the population of Crimea identifying as Russian, there wasn't that much of an outcry. But nonetheless, it is still a sovereign nation whose territories were taken away from them, and that was concerning and obviously a major power move by Vladimir Putin. But anyhow, Crimea is this little peninsula in the Black Sea. As you can see, directly south, you would run into modern-day Turkey. If you went directly west, you'd go into the Balkans in places like Moldova, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania, and places like that. And then if you go directly to the east, you would be going into inner Russia. So most of the war was fought on the Crimean Peninsula and in the Black Sea. Over 50,000 British and French troops fought Russian forces seeking to take over the Black Sea port of Sevastopol. During the war, one of the women who makes a name for herself is Florence Nightingale, who from 1820 to 1910 was a British nurse who became a pioneer in modern nursing. And during the Crimean War, men were dying more often of disease than by their combat wounds. So Nightingale's, what was known as Florence Nightingale's Light Brigade, was where she and other nurses superbly tended to wounded men during the war, even though fatalities remained high due to disease. After the war, there is a Peace of Paris. Russia emerged as the big loser in the Crimean War. They no longer had control of maritime trade along the Danube and had to formally recognize Turkish control of the mouth of the Danube. And they had to renounce their claims to Moldavia and Wallachia, which later became Romania. Russia renounced the role of protector of Greek Orthodox residents in the Ottoman Empire as a result of their loss in the Crimean War, because remember, that was how the whole thing started in the first place. And then Russia agreed to return all occupied territories to the Ottoman Empire, and the Black Sea was made a neutral sea so that other nations could trade on it. Finally, independence and the integrity of the Ottoman Empire was recognized and guaranteed all the way up until World War I, which saw ultimately the end of the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottoman Empire still is very much viewed as the sick man of Europe, despite the fact that it is protected after the end of the Crimean War. The aftermath of the war, Russia was absolutely shocked by how far they had fallen behind in terms of military power comparatively to, in particular, the British and the French. And Russia began to start moving towards industrialization and modernization of its army. So it's only in the latter portions of the 1800s that we are finally going to see the blessings of industrialization reach Russia in the form of new railroads, steel production, and various other implements to try to modernize their economy. A major obstacle to that development in Russia, however, is going to be the fact that they remain highly, highly autocratic under the leadership of an absolute monarch in the Tsar, and the idea that Russia is just absolutely massive. It has a massive population, and because of that, it's going to be more difficult to organize industrialization than in a place like Britain, which is relatively small and isolated in the form of an island. Russia is a huge continental landmass that is mostly populated very sparsely by peasant populations across the countryside. They didn't have the massive urban centers that Britain, Prussia, France, etc. had. Russia has, they have St. Petersburg, they have Moscow, but outside of those two places, Russia is largely populated by rural peasants, and there isn't a huge urbanization movement where people migrate from rural areas to urban areas in Russia until the turn of the 20th century, the 1900s. Talking about France, the Second French Republic. France had put into place a constitution with a unicameral legislature known as the National Assembly and a very strong executive power, and popularity elected the president of the republic. But remember that the Second French Republic is very short-lived. It only lasts for 4 years because the president that they elect to power, President Louis Napoleon, ends up waging a coup against the Second French Republic, overthrowing the government and establishing the Second French Empire under his leadership, whereupon he takes the title of Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. And he remains Emperor of France from 1852 all the way up until 1871. And so President Louis Napoleon, before he becomes emperor, was seen as a symbol of stability and greatness. Of course, the playing upon the name of Napoleon was itself important because many voters were swayed by the Napoleonic legend of greatness and stability and desired to have another Bonaparte in control. But President Louis Napoleon was dedicated to law and order. He was opposed to socialism and radicalism, and he favored the conservative classes, the church, the army, the property owners, and the businesses. And in return for the support of the conservatives, Louis had to make some concessions. So he, in his early days as president, had to kind of give into some of the demands of conservatives more than he really wanted to in order to gain their support. One of the examples of this is known as the Falloux Laws. The Falloux Laws is where Louis Napoleon returned control of education to the church. He didn't do this. This is the first example of real politic that we're talking about, by the way. Okay, knowing the game of politics, Louis Napoleon said, I need conservative support. But the only way to get the support of the conservatives was to make tough decisions that he didn't necessarily want to make. The Falloux Laws being one of them. So what he does is he gives control of the education system in France back over to the church in return for support from the church. Okay? This is interesting because ultimately he will take that back once he becomes emperor and there is no longer a threat to his power. He minimized the influence of the legislative assembly. He supported policies that were favorable to the army so as to gain support from military figures. He also disenfranchised many poor people from voting who likely would not have supported him anyway because the poor urban classes of France were more likely to be radical and socialist and wouldn't have voted for him. And he ultimately destroyed the democratic socialist movement by jailing or exiling its leaders and closing down labor unions, which served as a check to his power. So each of these are going to be moves that in the early days of President Louis Napoleon's campaigning for becoming president of France and securing the support of his constituents, that ultimately down the line he will actually back off of some of these more conservative agendas. And the Legislative Assembly did not grant Louis Napoleon either payment of his large personal debt or allowance for a second presidential term. So in response to this, he plotted a coup to become emperor. And again, that's another very real politics sort of move. So, when he is president, even though he seemingly is doing a pretty good job and is well liked by conservatives and the military and the church, he ultimately plots a coup once the Legislative Assembly refuses to allow him a second presidential term. And this is where we get into the Second Empire, also sometimes called the Liberal Empire, which is maybe a little bit confusing because I've been talking about how Louis Napoleon is largely conservative. But of the conservative leaders of the age of realpolitik, he is actually quite liberal on a domestic level in France. So in December of 1851, Emperor Napoleon III took control of the government in a coup d'etat and became the official emperor the following year. Under his empire, under his leadership as emperor, he restored universal suffrage in 1852, and 92% of the people voted to make him president for 10 years. He pulls a classic Napoleon move. Napoleon I, by the way, did basically the exact same thing when he overthrew the Directory in 1799 in the coup d'etat Brumaire. France was the only country in Europe at that time to provide universal suffrage. And in 1853, 97% of voters agreed to make him a hereditary emperor, which again is very, very, very interesting and an indicator that, you know, once again, by allowing for, you know, here's the thing that's crazy. Universal suffrage is super radical for an idea at this time. As I mentioned, nowhere else in Europe had universal suffrage. America didn't even have universal suffrage at this time, okay? But he does it not because he cares so much about, he doesn't care about universal suffrage. He doesn't care about instituting liberal policies. He's a conservative. He does it because he knows people will love him for it, okay? He makes changes not based on his own personal opinions about universal suffrage or about, you know, promulgating democracy in France. He could care less. He wants to be the one that's in power, but he knows that by giving universal suffrage as a right, it is immediately going to be viewed by most people as an absolute brilliant move and an opportunity to participate in government. And because he is the one bestowing it to the people, they of course thank him in return for that by voting for him, okay? But it is nonetheless a move made with no other intention than establishing a very deliberate, concrete, and overt expression of power, okay? Of saying, I am the one who gave you the right to vote, and because I care about, on the surface for the newspapers, I care about the people of France are of course going to vote for me. All right, but this is establishing a deliberate power dynamic there. And from 1851 to 1859, Napoleon III's control was very direct and authoritarian. He strengthened his centralized power. An imperial aristocracy emerged that consisted largely of wealthy businessmen. He is completely okay with censorship of the press. And the government even sponsored official candidates in elections. So this is a very direct and authoritarian sort of maneuver by Napoleon III. And from 1859 to 1870, in the later part of his rule, he sets out to build the liberal empire by initiating a series of reforms. So when we think about Louis Napoleon, okay, or Napoleon III, he starts off as a super hard-lined authoritarian ruler, okay, very conservative, very conservative in his early days, because that conservatism was necessary in order to secure the loyalty of various institutions within France, such as the military and the church. After he's been emperor for about 7 or 8 years, he then goes about loosening his grip a bit and and initiating these reforms in France to modernize France, to do building projects in France, to lend French aid to the to projects in other areas, such as building railroads across other places in Europe, or building the Suez Canal, or things like that. All right. And so Napoleon III's rule provided a model for other political leaders in Europe, because he demonstrated how government could reconcile popular and conservative forces through authoritarian nationalism. And Napoleon III, Otto von Bismarck in Prussia, and then to a lesser extent Count Cavour down in Sardinia, Piedmont in Italy, are each going to practice this same brand of new conservatism, where they are, make no mistake, they are nationalist conservatives. But because nationalism previously had been in an earlier Revolution of 1848 era, nationalism had always been tied to liberalism. But when nationalism starts to be tied to authoritarian conservatism, it works a lot better, because they realized that through nationalist conservatism, they could push through reforms while maintaining power, due to the fact that people viewed them as mending the wounds or mending the gap of the liberal versus the conservative disagreements, or the radical versus the conservative disagreements about the future of governance. And so these conservative authoritarian nationalists are making reforms precisely because it is those reforms that are going to win them the affection of the people of their country. Not because they necessarily care so much about universal suffrage or completing a bunch of reforms. They make reforms in the interest of protecting and securing their own long-lasting power. So to give you some examples of some of the reforms that I'm talking about in France under Napoleon III, economic reforms resulted in a very healthy economy in France. They had been building infrastructure, railroads, canals, just regular hard paved roads, and the French hired Baron George von Haussmann, a German developer, to completely redesign the city of Paris, widen the roads out, create boulevards, which is a French word for a wide road, wide avenue. Okay, and they completely re-landscaped the entire city of Paris, which was still at this time filled with a bunch of narrow alleyways, corridors that went back to medieval times, right? But under Napoleon III in the 1850s, 1860s, there's this movement that completely changes the face of Paris and shapes Paris to be more favorable towards free trade. Under Napoleon III, French exports doubled between 1853 and 1864. He signed a liberal trade agreement with Britain in 1860, who was still a significant industrial power, of course, at that time. And it was perhaps the first time that any modern state had played such a direct role in initiating reforms that stimulated the economy. Meanwhile, in banking, they had the Credit Mobilier, which, or Mobilier, which is probably how it's pronounced, but Credit Mobilier funded industrial and infrastructural growth in France. France's metallurgical industry rivaled Britain's. They're starting to produce iron and steel. French investors financed large infrastructure projects in Spain, Russia, and Italy. And as I mentioned, the Suez Canal was completed in 1869. The Suez Canal ultimately was more used by the British than the French, to be honest, but it was the French who built it. So the French built the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal became the lifeline of the British Empire, who used it regularly to get over to the Indian Ocean so that they could trade with their colony in India. Political reforms. They extended power of the legislative assembly. Members were elected by universal suffrage every 6 years. Opposition candidates had greater freedom. Another political reform is that they returned control of secondary education to the to the government rather than the Catholic Church. Remember that he had just given control over to the Catholic Church under the Fallow laws. But the Fallow laws get revoked, and in response to this, the Pope was outraged and issued something called the Syllabus of Errors of 1864, which condemned all of these liberal moves that were being made in these European states by conservative politicians. So, they take the right of education back for the government of France, and they start establishing compulsory education laws for kids to legally have to attend school, just like you guys do today. Permitted trade unions and their right to strike. That's very liberal. Why would a conservative permit trade unions and their right to strike? It had everything to do with retaining power. Also easing censorship and granting amnesty to political prisoners. And supporting better housing in France, and supporting credit unions and the regulation of pawn shops to promote free trade, and individuals securing loans from banks and things like that. All of these are liberal movements being implemented by the otherwise conservative and authoritarian Napoleon III. And he's doing so, again, not only because he may on one hand view that these changes were necessary for France, but above and beyond being necessary for France, they were necessary for Louis Napoleon himself, in order to continue to retain political authority in the name of fixing problems for the nation of France, whether or not he agreed with them politically. And then foreign policy is the one area in which Napoleon III struggles, because foreign policy struggles resulted in very strong criticism of Napoleon both at home and abroad. For example, he sent French troops to Italy to rescue and restore Pope Pius IX, and the troops remained in Italy from 1849 to 1870. And this was an act that was condemned by the more radical Republicans, but was supported by conservatives and moderates. And then the French involvement in the Crimean War, which we talked about at the start of class today, also angered Republicans and liberals, although much of Europe saw Napoleon III as the victor in the war. So even though the French, under the leadership of Napoleon III, were victorious, and the Russians were humiliated in the Crimean War, at home in France, he drew criticism for getting France involved in this distant conflict over in Crimea. Also, the issue of colonialism in Algeria and other colonies in Africa, Indochina, and Mexico became a contentious political issue with anti-imperialists back home in France. Not everybody in Europe at this time was pro-imperialism. Many Europeans were actually against imperial colonization of European powers over distant regions because of the idea of liberalism and stuff like that, the idea that nations should be represented by the people who live in them, not dominated by European foreign powers. And so there are going to be anti-imperialists in France who are very outwardly critical of Napoleon III's imperialist intentions, particularly in Africa, but also to a lesser degree in what is now Vietnam, and then also in Latin America. But Napoleon's liberal reforms The reason he's doing those were precisely because the liberals were so critical of his foreign policy. So the more that he was seen as doing good work at home for French people by redesigning Paris, changing laws to favor liberal reforms and stuff like that, he was hoping it would divert people's attention away from his largely conservative foreign policy that they were so heavily critical of. And then the end of Napoleon III came with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871, whereupon Napoleon III was actually captured in the conflict. Here you can see him pictured sitting next to Otto von Bismarck, Louis Napoleon on the left, Otto von Bismarck on the right. Otto von Bismarck defeated Louis Napoleon in the conflict, and it was Otto von Bismarck's victory against the French in the Franco-Prussian War that began a precedent of Prussia upsetting the balance of power and German unification. And once Germany becomes unified into the German Empire, they would very quickly begin to stir the pot in European affairs and become a problem child in Europe. So Napoleon III and Chancellor Bismarck confer after Napoleon's defeat and capture at the Battle of Sedan in 1871. So folks, that brings me to the end of my lecture for today. I am going to be putting up the next reading guide assignment for you in the next few minutes. Please get that done by Wednesday. Other than that, have a wonderful rest of your Monday, and we will continue with talking about Italian and German unification at that time. Have a great day.